Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're deploying a Django and React application on Render. This is not the first video in this series, in fact we've already done 3 before, in which we covered the architecture of the deployment, we've changed our Django backend code so that it's ready to be deployed on Render, and we've also pushed that code to GitHub using Git. In this fourth video, we're going to continue and we're going to deploy our Django backend code on the Render cloud. And if we're taking a look at the architecture picture, we're going to be focusing on the items in the red box, so that in the end of this video, we have all of the services on Render ready and we have our backend code from GitHub connected, meaning that our application is deployed and available on the Render URL. Now, to realize that, we're going to be following 6 steps. We're going to start by logging into Render and seeing what it is all about. Then we're going to be creating our PostgreSQL database, and after that we're also going to configure a Render web service, where we are going to create all of the settings for our deployment. Once the configuration is done, we're going to be checking our deployment and we're going to do some potential troubleshooting if we encounter any errors. And as a last step, I'm going to show you how you can create a super user in your app and you can log in to your admin portal of the Django app that we have deployed. So we are now on the Render Cloud application portal. And if you've not been here before and you don't have an account, you can click on Get Started for free. And in there, you can create an account using GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, or Google, or just do that with an email and with a password. Now, when you sign up, you don't need to provide any sort of payment information, so you can just go about and register and use the free services to check out what is going on. Now, I have already created that account, so please also make sure that you do that when you follow along. And I'm going to click on Sign In and sign in with my credentials. So when you sign in, you land on the Render dashboard. And in this Render dashboard, you can see that there are multiple service types which we can pick and can explore. Now, our first step of deploying our Django application is to create a PostgreSQL database. And we can find that service right here. And we can just go to new PostgreSQL to create one. Now, it's going to ask us for some information on this. Now, the first thing that it wants a name for our PostgreSQL instance. And I'm just going to call this Django Backend Tutorial. Now, all of the other information, such as the database name or the user, you can put in some information if you want, but I'm just going to leave it empty and then it gets a randomly generated value. Now, for the region, it's always advised to pick the region closest to you and our users. It's currently selected on Oregon, but it's not really near me. So I'm going to pick Frankfurt in the EU. And you can see that the majority of rendered locations are based in the US, but there's also options for Asia and for Europe. Then it's going to ask us for a PostgreSQL version, and I'm just going to leave that as is. And also it's going to ask for a Datadog API key. Not really sure what it is, and we're going to leave that empty. Then we arrive at the instance types, and this is where for us the very nice thing starts, because you can see that for hobby projects you actually have a free tier so you can try this out. So that is the one that we will select. However, it does come with a warning that Render will delete your free database after 30 days unless you upgrade it to a paid instance. So you can at least profit from 30 days free just to check out if it is the thing for you. Also, Render suspends free databases after 72 hours of inactivity, so also keep that into mind. Now, there are also some options for professional use, which are from Starter, Standard, Pro, and Pro Plus. And even here, I think that the Starter and the Standard options actually are priced relatively well. So those are also great options if you just want to get started. For now, we're just going to let it be on free, and we're going to click on Create Database on the bottom left. Now, I must say, when I clicked on deploy the first time, I saw something that prompted me to put in card details, but then I clicked something else and clicked on free again, and now we're just continuing without providing any payment information. So it has worked just fine. And you can see that we now have a database which is currently being deployed called Django Backend Tutorial with my name, also when it's created, and the status of already available. Now, if you scroll down on your database, you get all of the connection information about the actual database. Now, one very important connection setting is the internal database URL. And the internal database URL actually provides a URL with all of the credentials of your database, which we can use as an environment variable to make sure that the connection between the code and the database is established correctly. So what I'm going to do right now is just make sure that this internal database URL can be viewed, and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to create a notepad where I'm going to store that URL for a minute, like this. And you can try to use this or to access this, but all my services will already have been shut off by the time that this tutorial comes out. Okay, so we have now copied over the internal database URL, and later on we're going to be creating an environment variable, because inside of our deployment settings, we have established that the database needs an environment variable called database URL. And the internal database URL actually is going to provide all of the information that DJ database URL needs to make sure that the connection with the database works. So that's the reason that we need to copy it and set that as an environment variable later on. Okay, so our database is now complete. So we can go back to our dashboard, and over there we will now see one of our available services, and we can easily access that by clicking the link. Now, the next thing that we need to create is a web service. And that web service is going to be connected to our GitHub code and is going to make sure that our code runs fine in the render cloud. So we're going to click on new and then click on web service. And in here, the first thing you need to do is connect your source code. So to connect to our Git provider, we're going to click on GitHub, and it's going to prompt us to log in. So in here, you need to provide your password, and then you get access to the GitHub repository. Now in here, you basically give Render permission to use your repositories to deploy the code. Now you can give it access to all repositories, but I'm going to give it access only to the repositories that it needs. So in this case, I'm just going to say that it gets access to the render deploy tutorial Django code, because this actually is the repository that I want to deploy. So I'm going to select that one right there and then click on Save. And now when we go to source code, it has the options of only the repositories that it's allowed to view. So I'm going to click that we want to deploy the render deploy tutorial Django code and click on Connect. Now it's actually not going to do anything yet because we have a few settings that we need to populate here. So first off, a name of your web service, and I'm just going to leave that as the same name as the GitHub repository. Then it has already correctly identified the language. You have a few other options right here, but in our case, our app is Python 3. It also states what branch we want to deploy, but that can stay on main. And it has already recognized that our other service is deployed in Frankfurt, so we also want to have this service in the same region. Now again, always pick the region closest to you. Then we get to some settings that we actually do need to populate. The root directory right here is fine, but in the build command, we are going to make a slight change. Because what we want to do is when render builds our application, we don't want it just to use pip install our requirements.txt, but we want it to do all of the actions that we have defined in our build.sh file. So next to pip install requirements.txt, also collect static and Python manage.py migrate. So what we can do right here is instead of mentioning pip install requirements.txt, we can get rid of that and do /, and then say that it needs to do build.sh. And this is just the path to the build file that it needs to run. And the reason that we do // and then build.sh is because the build.sh file is in the top part of my application. And that's the way that we get there. So if you have another folder structure and it is maybe a little bit further down, then you need to adjust that. Okay, then we also have a start command. And the start command is actually going to be a little bit different than what we have right here. Because this is actually going to be something else. It is going to be Python -m. And then we say G unicorn, which is one of the packages that we have installed for this deployment. And then we're going to refer to api.asgi, and then a colon, and then we say application. And then we do -k, and we also mention the other package that we have installed, which is uvcorn.workers, and then .uvcorn_worker. Like this. Now, the first thing we do here is we use GUnicorn to basically start our server, and then we tell it to take a look at api.asgi application. Now, this is actually a file inside of our project, because you can see that when we go to our Visual Studio Code and we go to the API folder, that we have the ASGI file right here. And actually, we refer to the word application after, which is this. And the word application actually refers to this part right here. So what we do in the command is we're using the ASGI to start up our project by using GUnicorn. And that is also why we changed the settings module here, so that it takes the right settings when it tries to start the server. Then the next part, I don't actually have too much details about why we need to put that in here, because I'm not so familiar with the UVcorn worker. But the reason that I've picked this string is that it's also exactly specified right here in the render documentation under the manual deployment. Because it says here as well Python-m GUnicorn, then the ASGI application, and then uvcorn.workers.uvcorn-worker. Then we again, similarly to the database, get to an instance type. And here you can again pick multiple different subscriptions. And even here, the starter and the standard are priced quite reasonably. So I think that's quite nice. But in our case, we're going to go for the free one. Now, of course, here there are also some limitations because it spin downs after periods of inactivity, does not support SSH access, those kind of things. But for us, this is just about testing the deployment, so that's completely fine. Now, what you will notice when you deploy this is that when you start up your server, it's going to take a while before it becomes active, because every time the server starts, it needs to wake up for a second before it's available. And when you pick one of the starter and one of the standard packages, you will not have that problem because your server will basically be always on. So this is the last setting that we need to do. And then we get to a section called environment variables. Now in our environment variables, we need to populate all of the variables that our code expects. Now if we go to our deployment settings file, you can see that we've used a series of environment variables. Now this render external hostname is going to be populated on the background by render, so we don't need to worry about that. But it is going to look for a secret key, which is currently not defined. So what we are going to do is make sure that inside of our environment variables, we have something called secret key. And in here, we can just click on generate, and then it will just generate a secret key for our application. And of course, I'm now showing it on the screen because this is just a proof of concept, but make sure that you don't share this information with anyone. Then the next one that it also expects, if we scroll down a little bit, is the database URL, because it needs to have the connection to the database. And that's why we store this internal URL inside of the notepad. So I'm going to copy over this entire string. And we're going to create an environment variable called database underscore URL. We paste in this entire string. And this is going to make sure that the connection of the database goes as we expect. Now, if we go down a little further, I don't actually see any more environment variables being used in our source code. So I think we are complete. Just make sure that if in your settings you refer to any sensitive information, such as passwords or even email addresses, always convert those to environment variables to make sure that it's not visible inside of your code, because that is incredibly important here. Okay, so we've set up all of the things that we need to set up. So if we go down under advanced, you have some other options for secret files, pre-deployment commands and auto-deploy, but we don't need any of these things. So we're just going to continue and click on deploy web servers. And now it's going to deploy our code, and it's actually going to show you step by step in this terminal what is going on. So hopefully everything goes the way that we expect. So you can already see that it's collecting the packages that are specified in our requirements.txt file. So it's able to find that, which is always good. And when we now check the logs, you can see that our build has actually failed. And the reason that it has failed is that it specifies that the render underscore external underscore hostname is actually not subscriptable. So it doesn't seem to be available. And it seems like I've actually made a small mistake inside of the code, because if I go to the deployment settings.py file, you can see that I did os.environ.get, and then I did the square brackets and render external hostname. However, when I take a look at my test code, I did it in a little bit of a different way. So let's try and see if that resolves this particular issue. So what I did before was os.environment.get, but then actually specify the round brackets for this one. So let's try that one on for a minute. And let's also make sure that this is reflected in this one right here. Now, to make sure that our code is being published again, we first need to push this to our GitHub repository, and then the deploy will start automatically again. So I'm going to save this change, and then we can do git add git commit -am, and in there specify updated deployment settings. And then we can do git push, and that will bring it to GitHub, but it should also trigger a new deploy inside of our render cloud. So let's take a look. And we can indeed see that a new deploy has started, and you can also see the message that we gave it, which is updated deployment settings. And when I now click on this deploy, it is again going to show us the process of building it. And it turns out we have exactly the same problem with our secret key. So let's also change that one and make sure that we publish it again. So inside of our code, we need to be a little bit more strict, because those don't need to be square brackets, but we actually need to make sure that they are round brackets. So I'm going to again save this and also check if our other environment variable has been done correctly. And this one actually is, because I don't specify the .get. So we can again do git add git commit -am, and then we do secret key change so that we know why it went wrong. And then again, git push. And now let's see what is going on in the third try. So in our event, we can indeed see that we have another deploy started right here. And let's see how it continues. Okay, and what it now states is that our build was successful. And if we scroll up a little bit, we can see that it also downloaded all of our packages, which is the pip install requirements.txt. We can also see that it has copied over the static files and put them in the folder called static files right there. And we see that all of our migrations have been applied to our database. So that also looks quite good. So what we can now do, and you can also see it inside of this terminal right here, that it has run the startup command, which means that it ran Python _m unicorn API blah 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 blah. And it now says that our service is alive, and it actually gives a response of 200, which makes me quite hopeful that this has gone correctly. Now, I must say I've done this a previous time when I was experimenting on how to deploy this. And even if this whole thing goes well and it says that your app is deployed, you can still encounter some server errors when going to the URL. But hopefully everything is okay for us. So to check out our backend, we can click on our URL on the top here, and let's hope that the result is good. And we can now see that we indeed get to our API route when we click the link. And that means that our deployment has gone quite well. And we can even see the URL here for our appointments. And if we click that, we can also create records to check if our database is working correctly. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create one record for my model, which has a start date, a class name, an end, and a title, just to see if we can successfully create a record in our database. So let's just take the start date of today, give it a class name of open, and then an end date of also today. And in the title, say successful deployment. And let's hope that's also the case. And we can post it, and we can now indeed see that we have a record inside of our database. So our post request was successful. So also the connection to our database seems to be just fine. So now that our web service is deployed, let's take a look what all of the things do that are actually in the menu. So in our events, you can track down your deployments and see what is going on. As you can see here, we had 2 deploys that did not go to plan, but the third one luckily was. Then we also have a section called logs, and this logs basically provides you detailed logs of your application. So if something is going wrong with your application, you can also check it out right here, and it might give you an indication of what's going on. Then you also have something called disks, but we cannot access that because we only have the free package, and you can only do this when you have a payment package. Environment brings us to the environment variables again. So if you need to add more, then this is the place to go. Shell is actually also not available for us. And also, I think previews is something about pull requests, Jobs is something you can schedule right here, but we don't have permission for that either. Metrics show a little bit of details about how your application runs, which would only make sense if you have it deployed over a little bit of a longer time. And it also has options for scaling, but that also comes when you have the starter package. And the last thing is the settings, which are actually the settings that we've put in when we deployed this. So you can make some changes here. So let's say that you made a mistake somewhere, you can always correct that right here. And this is also the place where you can add a custom domain so that it's not on the link of .onrender.com, but you can actually get a domain name from yourself. Now, of course, this leaves us with one challenge because we can't actually access the shell. And in the shell, you would usually create your super user. So if you would deploy it on the free tier and you would have login functionality, you would actually essentially lock yourself outside of your application. Luckily, there is a way around to create a super user without using this shell. Now, to do that, we need to follow two steps. And the first one is in the environment variables. And basically, inside of these environment variables, we are going to define all of the information that Django needs to create a super user. And this is also quite a secure way to do it as a one-time off, so that the credentials are actually not available somewhere in your code. So we're going to go to environment inside of our web service and then click on edit. And we're going to be adding a few environment variables. The first one that it needs is create underscore super user. And we're going to set that to true because we want to create a super user. And this is going to notify Django that it actually needs to be a super user permission. Then we need to provide the exact same information that Django would usually ask you for if you create a super user on your local computer. So the first thing is Django underscore super user underscore email. And for now, we can set that to email@email.com. But of course, you need to provide your own email address here. Then it is also going to ask us for Django underscore super user underscore password. And this password is going to be, in my case, testing321, but please pick a more secure password. And as a last step, it also always asks you for a Django underscore super user underscore username. And the username is going to be user1. Now we're going to save these changes and deploy, but this actually won't do anything yet. To make sure that we actually create a super user, we need to go to our code and tell our build.sh file that if we have something in our environment variables, we need to create a super user. The way that we do that is we mention in here if, and then 2 times a square brackets, and then a $sign, and then create underscore super user, and then a point comma like this. Then we want to do Python manage.py create super user. And then we do --no -input. And then as a last step, we do fi to make sure that it's closed. Now what this function will do is going to evaluate if in our environment variables we have something called create super user, which is equal to true. If that is the case, then it's going to run Python manage.py create super user, and it's going to look inside of our environment variables and recognize that we have provided a username, an email, and also a password. And it's going to create the super user with that input. Now, actually, we put in here no input, and that is because when you usually run this function, it's going to ask you those questions in the terminal, but by doing no input, it's going to take the answers from our environment variables. Now, all we need to do to make sure that the super user is being created with the credentials that we have just supplied right here is to push this to our GitHub repository. So then we're going to save this file right here, and then we can trigger the deploy and make sure that this happens by adding it to our GitHub repository. And we do that with git add, then git commit -am, and we can call this create our super user. And then as a last step, we do git push to bring it to GitHub. And now it should create a super user with the credentials that we have specified inside of our environment variables. And you can see right here that currently, if we take a look, that our username is going to be user1 and our password is going to be testing321. So let's check out if this deployment is going to be successful. And now when we check the latest deploy right here, you can see that somewhere in these lines, build.sh line 9 was equal to true and command not found. But let's see in our admin portal if we do get a login with that user. So we're going to go to our backend code right here, and then we'll do /admin. And now we can check if we can log in with the environment variables that we have just set. So if we check out our environment variables, we can see that the Django username was user1 and our password was testing321. So let's do user1, and now we can do testing321. And when I now click on login, you can see that we're actually inside of our admin portal and the user has been successfully created. And I already tried it once before, so I have 2 users in here right now. And that is how you can arrange that. Now, this is just useful to create your initial superuser, so I would recommend to delete that part from your build.sh file and also remove the environment variables, because once you're in with a superuser, you can just create any additional users or do anything from your admin portal. And that is actually all for this video. In this video, I showed you how you can deploy your Django backend to render. In the next video, we're going to continue and we're going to do the same thing, but then for the full process of our React.js frontend. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.